The boy was found clutching a piece of paper so tightly that his knuckles had turned white as bone. The sheriff pulled him from the dust trail just outside the county line, barely breathing, barely alive. No one knew where he came from. No one knew what he was running from. But the terror in his eyes spoke a language older than words. The frontier town had seen plenty of lost souls wander through its streets, but this one carried something different, something darker, something that made even the hardest men look away. If you want to see how far justice can reach in the wildest corners of the frontier, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like this. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His clothes were torn from the prairie brush, his feet bleeding through worn boots that barely held together. The sheriff carried him to the small room behind the county office, laid him on a cot, and waited. The town doctor came, checked him over, said the body would heal, but the mind might take longer. When the boy finally opened his eyes 3 hours later, he didn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling like he was watching ghosts dance across the wooden beams. The sheriff sat beside him in silence, knowing that some stories can't be rushed. Some truths need their own time to surface. The note was still in the boy's hand. The sheriff had tried to take it once, gently, but the boy's grip only tightened. So he left it there. Whatever was written on that paper had kept this child alive through miles of empty frontier, through cold nights and hungry days. It meant something. The sheriff had learned long ago that the smallest details often held the biggest secrets. A torn sleeve, a missing button, a crumpled piece of paper held like a lifeline. These were the breadcrumbs that led to truth in a land where lies grew as thick as tumbleweeds. By evening, word had spread through saloon and the general store. A boy had been found. No family claimed him. No one recognized him. The frontier was full of orphans and runaways. But something about this one felt different. The sheriff noticed how certain folks avoided his questions. How some eyes shifted when he asked if anyone had seen a child traveling alone. In small towns, silence often spoke louder than words. And this silence had weight to it, had edges, had the shape of something people wanted buried. The boy ate a little bread that night, drank some water, but still didn't speak. The sheriff sat across from him, patient as stone, and said nothing either. Sometimes the best way to hear a story is to make space for it, to let the quiet grow so heavy that words become the only escape. The lantern flickered between them. Outside, the frontier town settled into its uneasy sleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring questions no one wanted to answer. The boy's fingers loosened slightly around the note, just slightly, but the sheriff saw it, and he knew the truth was coming. That night, the sheriff couldn't sleep. He stood by the window of his small quarters, watching the empty street below. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for this boy, or someone was hoping he'd never be found. The frontier was a place where people came to disappear, to become someone new, to leave their sins in the dust behind them. But children don't run alone without reason. They don't clutch desperate notes without cause. The sheriff had seen enough darkness in his years wearing the badge to know that evil doesn't always ride into town with guns blazing. Sometimes it lives quiet. Sometimes it wears a respectable face. Sometimes it hides in plain sight until someone brave enough pulls back the curtain. Morning came cold and gray. The boy was awake when the sheriff entered. Sitting up on the cot, the note now resting in his open palm. He looked at the sheriff with eyes that had aged a lifetime in just a few days. Then, slowly, he extended his small hand forward, offering the paper. The sheriff took it carefully, unfolded it with the reverence of a man who knows he's about to cross a line he can't uncross. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, written by someone who knew time was running out. And as the sheriff's eyes moved across those words, everything he thought he understood about this quiet frontier town began to crack apart like sun-baked earth. The note contained only 7 words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 crimes. They took the others to the homestead. The sheriff read it twice, 3 times, feeling his jaw tighten with each pass. Others. There were others. This boy wasn't the only one. The frontier suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating, like the vast prairie had shrunk to the size of a noose. The sheriff looked at the child, who was watching him with that same ancient sadness, waiting, waiting to see if this man with a badge would be like all the others who looked the other way, or if he would be different, if he would be enough. The boy finally spoke, and his voice came out like gravel scraped across bone. He told of the abandoned ranch 3 miles past the canyon ridge, told of a wagon that came through towns picking up children no one would miss, orphans, runaways, kids whose parents had died crossing the frontier or lost everything to drought and desperation. The boy had been traveling with his sister when the man approached them near the rail depot, said he ran a homestead that needed workers, said he'd feed them, house them, teach them honest trade. The boy's sister had wanted to believe it. She was tired. They both were. So they climbed into that wagon, and everything changed. The ranch was a nightmare dressed up as salvation. The children worked from dawn until their hands bled. They slept in a barn with no heat. Food came in portions too small to fill a growing stomach. But the worst part wasn't the work or the hunger. It was the fear. The man who ran the place, he had a way of looking at the children that made their skin crawl. He had friends who visited, men who wore suits too fine for ranch work, men who paid money to walk through that barn like they were inspecting cattle at auction. The boy didn't understand it all, but he understood enough. Understood that some of the children who went into the main house didn't come back the same. Understood that his sister was next. So he ran, grabbed a note his sister had written in secret, hidden under her thin mattress. She'd told him that if anything happened, if he got a chance to escape, he should find help, find the law, find someone who still believed in right and wrong. The boy had waited for his moment, slipped through a gap in the barn wall during a dust storm that turned the world brown and blind, and he ran. Ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. Ran until the sheriff found him on that dust trail, more dead than alive, clutching the only proof he had that his sister's nightmare was real. The sheriff felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar feeling, the same one he got before every moment that defined what kind of man he truly was. He'd seen corruption before, seen powerful men buy their way out of justice, seen communities turn silent when truth became inconvenient. But children, the stealing and breaking of children, that crossed every line, that burned through every compromise, that demanded a reckoning. He asked the boy his sister's name. The boy said it soft like a prayer, asked how many others were at the homestead. The boy held up both hands, fingers spread. 10, maybe more. The boy wasn't sure because new ones came sometimes, and old ones disappeared. The sheriff stood, walked a window, looked out at the peaceful morning street. Shopkeepers opening their doors. Women carrying baskets. Everything normal. Everything fine. While 3 miles away, children suffered in silence. While men in fine suits treated human lives like merchandise. While a whole town pretended not to know. The boy asked the question that mattered most. Asked in a voice so small it barely made sound. Will you help her? The sheriff turned back, looked at this broken child who'd survived hell itself to deliver a message of hope, and he made a promise, not with flowery words or grand speeches, just a simple nod, a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, a look that said some things are worth dying for. The frontier had taken enough. It wouldn't take these children too. The sheriff didn't tell anyone in town where he was going. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Someone had been supplying that homestead with victims. Someone had been looking the other way, maybe for money, maybe for fear, maybe because the man running that nightmare had connections that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The frontier was built on people escaping their past. But some people brought their darkness with them and planted it like poison seeds. The sheriff loaded his rifle, filled his canteen, and saddled his horse as the sun climbed higher. The boy watched from the doorway, silent witness to whether justice was real or just another empty promise. The ride to the canyon ridge took 2 hours. The land was harsh and beautiful the way only the frontier could be, vast stretches of nothing that somehow felt like everything. The sheriff followed the landmarks the boy had described. A twisted Joshua tree, a dry creek bed, the skeleton of a covered wagon half buried in sand. And then there was the homestead. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. A main house with a porch, A barn, a corral, smoke rising from a chimney. The kind of place people dreamed of building when they headed west. But the sheriff knew better. Knew that evil often wore ordinary faces. Knew that monsters didn't always look like monsters. He approached slow, keeping to the edge of the property, where the prairie grass grew tall enough to provide cover. His eyes scanned the area, noting details. 2 horses tied near the house. A wagon by the barn. No children visible, which meant they were probably inside working or locked away. The sheriff had done this kind of work before, had walked into situations where one wrong move meant death. But something about this felt different, heavier, because this wasn't about stopping a robbery or settling a dispute. This was about children who'd been stolen from childhood itself, who'd been turned into commodities, who'd been taught that the world was a place where no one comes to save you. A man emerged from the barn, tall, weathered, wearing a rancher's clothes, but moving with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. He looked around the property like a king surveying his kingdom, then headed toward the main house. The sheriff waited until the man disappeared inside, then moved closer. The barn door was partially open. Inside, he could hear sounds, small movements, whispered voices, children. The sheriff's hand tightened on his rifle. Every instinct told him to kick that door down and start making arrests. But instinct got people killed. Strategy kept him alive. He circled to the back of the property where a small window looked into the barn. Through the dirty glass, he saw them, children ranging from maybe 6 years old to early teens, all dressed in tattered clothes, all wearing the same expression of defeated exhaustion. They worked in silence, sorting through piles of something he couldn't quite make out. One girl looked up briefly, and the sheriff's heart stopped. She looked so much like the boy. Same eyes, same sharp features. The sister. She was alive, but barely. The light in her eyes had been dimmed by days or weeks of horror. The sheriff had to look away for a moment, had to steady himself against the rage that wanted to make him reckless. Footsteps approached the barn from inside the house. The sheriff pressed himself against the wall, listening. 2 voices. One belonged to the rancher. The other was different, smoother, educated. The kind of voice that belonged to someone with money and influence. They were discussing business, discussing numbers, discussing which children would be suitable for a buyer coming through next week. The words hit the sheriff like physical blows. This wasn't just forced labor. This was trafficking. This was organized. This was bigger than one evil man on an isolated homestead. This was a network. The sheriff made his decision. He couldn't wait for backup he didn't trust. Couldn't risk these children disappearing before he returned with help. The frontier had taught him that sometimes justice means standing alone. Sometimes it means walking into the fire because no one else will. He checked his ammunition, said a quiet prayer to a God he wasn't sure listened anymore, and prepared to do what he'd sworn to do the day he pinned that badge to his chest. Protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves, even if it cost him everything. The sheriff walked through the front door of that homestead like judgment itself. Gun raised, voice steady. The 2 men froze, their conversation dying mid-sentence. The rancher reached for a weapon on the table, but the sheriff was faster. One shot rang out, shattering the silence of the prairie, and the rancher's gun clattered to the floor. The other man, the one in the fine suit, raised his hand slowly, his face draining of color. He started talking fast, offering money, offering connections, offering everything except accountability. The sheriff told him to shut his mouth, told him the only words he wanted to hear were the names of everyone involved in this operation. The man in the suit suddenly discovered cooperation. The children were freed within the hour. The sheriff broke the locks on the barn, pushed open those heavy doors, and watched as sunlight poured in like mercy itself. The kids stood there blinking, unsure, afraid to believe rescue was real. The boy's sister saw the sheriff, and something broke inside her. She ran to him, the stranger with a badge, and collapsed into sobs against his shoulder. One by one, the others followed, children who'd forgotten what kindness looked like, who'd learned to expect only cruelty. The sheriff held them, all of them, and promised over and over that they were safe now, that no one would hurt them again. that he would make sure of it. The boy arrived an hour later, brought by the town doctor who the sheriff had finally trusted with the truth. Brother and sister reunited in that dusty yard, holding each other like they were the last solid things in a liquid world. The sheriff watched them, feeling something in his chest that he thought had died years ago. Hope, maybe, or faith. The belief that sometimes, despite everything, the good guys do win. The frontier tried to make people hard, tried to teach them that caring was weakness. But watching those two children hold each other, the sheriff knew that the opposite was true. Caring was the only strength that mattered. The man in the fine suit gave up 12 names before the day ended. Names of buyers, names of suppliers, names of people in positions of power who've been looking the other way or actively participating. The sheriff sent word to marshals in 3 territories, sent telegrams to newspapers in bigger cities, made sure this story wouldn't be buried or forgotten. The frontier was about to learn that some secrets, once exposed, burned too bright to hide. Some crimes are too dark to ignore. The network these men had built was about to collapse, and everyone involved was about to face consequences they thought money and connections could prevent. The homestead itself was burned to the ground. The sheriff and several men from town who finally found their courage stood and watched it go up in flames. The children stood safely behind them, holding hands, watching their nightmare turn to ash. No one spoke. No one needed to. Fire has a way of purifying things, of turning horror into memory and memory into resolve. That ranch would never hurt anyone again, would never be a monument to cruelty, would just be scorched earth and a warning. This is what happens when you steal innocence. This is what happens when you cross lines that should never be crossed. The children were placed with families across the territory. Good families. Families the sheriff personally vetted. The boy and his sister stayed together, taken in by a widow who ran a small farm and needed the company as much as they needed safety. The last time the sheriff saw them, they were standing on that widow's porch, waving as he rode away. They looked different already. Not fixed, not healed, but beginning to remember what it felt like to be children again, beginning to believe that the world held more light than darkness. The sheriff rode back toward town as the sun set over the prairie, painting everything gold and crimson. He thought about the note, about 7 words that had changed everything, about one boy's courage to run and one sister's love that gave him something to run toward. The frontier was a hard place, unforgiving, brutal, but was also a place where individuals could still matter, where one person doing the right thing could shift the balance between cruelty and mercy. He touched the badge on his chest and thought about all the other notes out there, clutched in desperate hands, waiting for someone to care enough to read them. The work was never finished, the darkness never fully defeated, but every child saved was a victory. Every monster stopped was progress. And in a land as wild as the American frontier, progress was measured one brave choice at a time. Word of what happened at the homestead spread through the territory like wildfire through dry brush. Other sheriffs started asking questions in their own towns. Other children started coming forward with stories that had been silenced by fear. The arrest began slowly, then accelerated. Men in positions of authority, business owners, even a judge 2 counties over. The network the man in the fine suit had revealed stretched further than anyone imagined. The frontier had been harboring a system of exploitation that thrived on isolation and silence. But silence, once broken, is hard to restore. The testimonies piled up. The evidence became undeniable. Justice moved slow, but it moved. The sheriff received letters from families whose children had disappeared years before. Letters filled with grief and desperate hope. Some of those children were found, returned home, reunited with parents who'd spent years wondering and praying. But some weren't found, would never be found, had been lost to the darkness before anyone knew to look. Those were the letters that kept the sheriff awake at night, the ones he couldn't answer with good news. The frontier took, and sometimes it never gave back. All he could do was make sure it took less from now on. Make sure that other children didn't vanish into that same void. The trial of the rancher drew crowds from 3 territories. People wanted to see justice served. wanted to witness accountability for crimes that had been whispered about but never addressed. The rancher stood in that courtroom, looking smaller than he had on his property, without his power, without his control. Just a man facing the consequences of choices that destroyed lives. The children who could bear it testified. The boy's sister was one of them. She stood in front of that court and spoke truth with a voice that shook but never broke. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on every count. The sentencing was harsh and swift. Some monsters don't get redemption stories. The boy visited the sheriff often in those following months, would sit in the office, watching him work, asking questions about justice and law and how to know the right thing to do. The sheriff answered honestly, told him that right and wrong weren't always clear, that good people sometimes made bad choices, and bad people sometimes are behind good intentions. But he also told him that when you see someone suffering and you have the power to help, the choice becomes simple. You help. You stand up. You do what needs doing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The boy listened to every word like he was storing them up for a future only he could see. One afternoon, the boy asked if evil could ever really be stopped, if darkness could ever be completely defeated. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the frontier town going about its daily business. He thought about all the years he'd worn the badge, all the fights, all the victories and failures. He told the boy the truth. Evil can't be completely stopped because it lives in human hearts, and human hearts are complicated, but it can be fought, it can be pushed back, it can be made smaller and weaker by people who refuse to look away. The frontier will always have its shadows, but will also always have people willing to carry light into those shadows. That's the eternal balance. That's the work that never ends. The widow who took in the boy and his sister reported back to the sheriff regularly, said they were doing better, having fewer nightmares, starting to laugh again. The sister had begun teaching the younger children in town how to read. The boy was learning to work the land, finding peace in the simple rhythms of planting and harvest. They were becoming whole again, piece by piece. It was slow. It was hard, but it was happening. The sheriff took comfort in that, took strength from it, because for every horror the frontier created, there were quiet miracles of healing happening in small farms and modest homes. People learning to trust again, learning to hope again, learning that the worst thing that ever happened to them didn't have to define everything that came after. The note itself, the one that started everything, was kept in the sheriff's desk drawer. He looked at it sometimes when cases felt hopeless, when corruption seemed too entrenched to fight, when the darkness felt overwhelming. Those 7 words reminded him why the badge mattered, why standing alone was sometimes necessary, why one person's courage to ask for help could change the course of entire lives. They took the others to the homestead. A child's desperate cry for help, a sister's love translated into words, a map to horror that became a path to salvation. The sheriff would carry those words with him for the rest of his days, would remember that sometimes justice begins with nothing more than someone caring enough to listen. The months turned into a year. The territory began to heal, though scars remained. New laws were passed regarding the protection of orphaned children. Systems were put in place to track traveling workers and investigate isolated homesteads. The changes came slowly, fought against by those who preferred the old ways where asking questions was considered impolite and minding your own business was considered virtue. But the tide had shifted. Too many people had seen the cost of silence. Too many families had lost children to predators who operated in plain sight. The frontier was learning a hard lesson about the difference between freedom and lawlessness, about the price of looking away. The sheriff trained 2 deputies that year, young men who'd been moved by what happened, who wanted to be part of something that mattered. He taught them everything he knew about reading situations, about knowing when to push and when to wait, about understanding that the badge wasn't about power but about responsibility. He told them stories, not the heroic kind, the real kind, about the children who weren't saved in time, about the mistakes that cost lives, about the weight of carrying other people's pain. He wanted them to understand what they were signing up for, wanted them to know that this work would break their hearts over and over, and they had to choose to do it anyway. The boy's sister visited the sheriff one afternoon with a request. She wanted to start a school specifically for children who'd been through trauma, a place where they could learn and heal together, where they didn't have to pretend to be okay, where teachers understood that sometimes a child freezing up during a lesson wasn't about being difficult, but about being triggered by a memory they couldn't control. She had no money, no building, just an idea and a determination that reminded the sheriff of the note she'd written, that same desperate hope that someone would care enough to help. The sheriff spent the next 3 months calling in every favor he had. By summer, the school opened in a renovated building at the edge of town. The network that had been uncovered led to more discoveries. Other homesteads, other operations, not all involving children, but all involving exploitation. Workers brought in with promises of fair wages and then trapped by debt. Women lured by offers of domestic work and then forced into worse. The frontier had become a hunting ground for a certain kind of predator, and cleaning it up required coordination across territories. Sheriffs and marshals who'd rarely communicated before began sharing information. Patterns emerged. Names repeated. What had started as one boy's rescue became a multi-territory effort to dismantle systems of trafficking that had operated for years. Not everyone in the town supported the changes. Some business owners complained that too many questions were being asked, that honest work was being disrupted by paranoid investigations, that the sheriff had overstepped his authority and created problems where none existed. They pointed to the cost, the time spent, the inconvenience. They never mentioned the children, never acknowledged that the problems being created were actually solutions to horrors they'd chosen to ignore. The sheriff lost friends over it, lost the support of people he'd once respected. But he gained something more valuable, the trust of the vulnerable, the knowledge that when someone needed help, they could come to him and be believed. There was an attempt on the sheriff's life that winter, a gunman in an alley, a bullet that missed by inches. The man was caught and questioned. He gave up the name of who hired him within an hour, a businessman who'd been connected to the trafficking network and was facing trial. The businessman was arrested for attempted murder on top of his other charges. The message was clear. Some people would rather kill than face consequences, would rather silence truth than accept accountability. But the attempt failed. The sheriff walked away with nothing more than a tear in his coat and a reminder that doing right often meant being targeted by wrong. He wore that torn coat for months afterward, a badge of honor, a testament to what he stood for. The boy asked the sheriff once if he ever got scared, if facing dangerous men ever made him want to run away. The sheriff thought about lying, about maintaining some image of fearless heroism. But he told the truth instead. He got scared all the time. Fear was a natural response to danger. But courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite the fear. Choosing to do what mattered even when your hands shook and your stomach churned. The boy nodded, understanding. He knew about fear, knew about choosing to run toward help rather than just away from danger. They sat in silence for a while, two people who both faced darkness and chosen not to let it win. The frontier stretched out beyond the window, wild, dangerous, beautiful, waiting for the next story to unfold. 2 years after rescue, the territory held a gathering to honor those who'd fought against the trafficking network. Sheriffs and marshals from across the frontier came together. Awards were given. Speeches were made. But the sheriff sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't done this for recognition. Hadn't worn the badge to become a hero. He'd done it because children were suffering and someone needed to do something. Because the note in a boy's hand had asked a question that demanded an answer. The real heroes, he thought, were the children who'd survived, who'd found the strength to testify, who'd chosen to heal rather than be consumed by bitterness. They were the ones who deserved to be honored. The boy and his sister attended the gathering. They were asked to speak, to share their story with the assembled lawmen. The sister stood at the podium, now 14 years old, and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. She didn't talk about her suffering, didn't dwell on the details of what had been done to her and the others. Instead, she talked about the moment the sheriff walked through that door, about the feeling of being seen after being invisible for so long, about learning that rescue was real and justice was possible. She talked about her brother's courage, about the note that changed everything. And she talked about responsibility, about how every person in that room had the power to be the one who listens, the one who acts, the one who refuses to look away. After the gathering, several sheriffs approached the one who'd started it all. They asked for advice, asked how to identify the signs of trafficking in their own territories, asked how to build trust with communities so that victims would come forward. The sheriff shared everything he'd learned, told them to watch for children who flinched at touch, workers who seemed afraid of their employers, properties that kept to themselves too carefully, strangers who asked too many questions about vulnerable families. He told them that prevention required attention, required giving a damn even when it was inconvenient, required believing victims even when their stories sounded impossible. The frontier was changing because these men were willing to change with it. The school the sister had started grew. More children came, some from trafficking situations that were uncovered in the broader investigation, some from other traumas the frontier inflicted, abuse, neglect, violence. The school became a sanctuary, a place where broken things could be carefully mended. Teachers there learned specialized techniques, how to handle panic attacks, how to create environments that felt safe, how to teach children who'd been taught that learning was just another form of control. The sister worked there every day, using her own experience to help others navigate theirs. The sheriff visited often, watching this young woman transform pain into purpose. It was the kind of alchemy that made all the hard days worth it. The widow who'd taken the boy and his sister passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years after rescue. She left the farm to them, left them a life and a future, and a place to call home. The boy, now nearly 16, decided to keep working the land. His sister divided her time between the farm and the school. They built a life that honored what they'd survived without being defined by it. The sheriff stood at the widow's funeral, looking at these two young people who'd been saved by a note and a badge and the belief that someone would care. They'd not only survived, they'd thrived, had taken the worst thing that could happen and somehow, impossibly, grown flowers from it. The investigations continued. More networks were uncovered, more children saved, but there were also failures. Operations discovered too late, victims who couldn't be found, perpetrators who escaped justice through wealth or connections or simple geography. The frontier was vast, and darkness had many places to hide. The sheriff learned to carry both the victories and the defeats. Learned that you can't save everyone, but that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to save whoever you can. Every child rescued was worth every sleepless night. Every trafficker arrested was worth every threat made against him. The work was endless. The progress was slow, but it was progress. The note remained in the sheriff's desk drawer. Sometimes other lawmen would visit, and he'd show it to them. 7 words written by a desperate girl. 7 words that had sparked a movement. 7 words that proved attention and action could change the world in small but meaningful ways. They took the others to the homestead. The sheriff would read those words and remember everything that followed. The fear and the courage. The darkness and the light. The children's faces when they realized they were free. The sister's voice at the podium. The boy's question about whether evil could be stopped. And he'd remember his answer. It can be fought. It can be pushed back. One note at a time. One rescue at a time. One person caring enough to do something at a time. 5 years after the rescue, the boy came to the sheriff with a decision. He wanted to wear a badge. Wanted to learn to do what the sheriff did. Wanted to be someone who stood between the vulnerable and those who preyed on them. The sheriff wasn't surprised. He'd seen it coming in the way the boy watched him work, in the questions he asked, in the way he practiced with a rifle and studied the law books kept in the office. But the sheriff was careful. He asked the boy why. Asked if this was about revenge or justice. Asked if he understood the cost. The boy's answer was simple. He understood the cost because he'd paid it, and he understood the value because he'd been saved. That was enough. The training was hard. The sheriff didn't give the boy any special treatment because of their history. If anything, he was harder on him, made him earn every skill, every insight, every piece of knowledge. The frontier didn't care about your story, didn't give you extra chances because you'd survived trauma. It demanded competence, demanded strength, demanded the ability to stand firm when everything around you was chaos. The boy never complained, never asked for it to be easier. He absorbed every lesson, made mistakes and learned from them, grew into the role like he was born for it. His sister watched the transformation with mixed feelings, pride and worry wrapped together. She knew her brother's heart, knew he'd found his purpose, but she also knew the price that purpose demanded. The sheriff took the boy on his first real call 6 months into training. A report of children working in dangerous conditions at a mining operation 2 territories over. They rode for 3 days, camping under stars that blazed across the frontier sky like scattered diamonds. The sheriff taught as they traveled, talked about how to read people, how to know when someone was lying, how to balance mercy and justice, how to carry trauma without letting it consume you. The boy listened to everything, asked questions that showed he was thinking deeply about the work, about the responsibility. By the time they reached the mining camp, the boy wasn't just a trainee anymore. He was becoming a lawman. The mining operation was exploiting children, but not in the same way as the homestead. These kids were technically paid, technically free to leave, but they were trapped by poverty and lack of options. Their families needed the money. The mine owners knew it and took advantage, paid pennies for work that destroyed young bodies, created conditions that no child should endure. The sheriff and the boy gathered evidence, interviewed workers, built a case. It took 2 weeks, but they shut down the operation, got the children into safer situations, arrested the mine owners. The boy performed perfectly, professional, thorough, but the sheriff saw the anger beneath, the personal connection to children being exploited. They talked about it on the ride back, about how to use anger as fuel without letting it drive decisions, about how the badge required clarity even when your heart was screaming. The boy earned his badge a year after he first asked for it. The ceremony was small, just the sheriff pinning the medal to his chest in the office where they'd first met so many years ago. The boy's sister was there. Several of the children who'd been rescued from a homestead came. They'd grown, changed, but they remembered what it meant to be saved, remembered that someone had cared enough to fight for them, and now one of their own was joining that fight. The sheriff gave a short speech, told the boy that the badge was a promise to stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves, to bring light where there was darkness, to never look away even when looking away would be easier. The boy accepted it with hands that didn't shake, with eyes that understood, with a heart that had been broken and remade into something stronger. They worked together for the next 3 years, sheriff and deputy, teacher and student. 2 men who understood what it meant to fight for justice in a place where justice often felt like a dream. They rode together, investigated together, faced danger together. The frontier threw everything at them: corrupt officials, armed gangs, traffickers who'd learned to hide better, but hadn't stopped operating. Each case was different, but the core was always the same: someone vulnerable, someone powerful taking advantage, and 2 men with badges standing in between. They won more than they lost, saved more than they couldn't, and slowly, territory by territory, the frontier became a little bit safer. The sister school expanded to 3 buildings, served over 100 children, became a model that other territories started copying. She received funding from unexpected places, donations from families who'd been helped, support from politicians who'd been moved by her testimony years ago. The school became her life's work, her way of turning suffering into salvation. The sheriff and the boy would visit when they were in town, watching children learn and laugh and heal. 3 different paths that started from the same horror, 3 different ways of fighting back. The sister with education, the boy with a badge, the sheriff with experience and unwavering commitment. Together, they were changing the frontier one life at a time. The sheriff knew he was getting older, felt it in his bones on cold mornings, felt it in the way wounds took longer to heal. The frontier was a young man's game, and he wasn't young anymore, but he'd found something better than youth. He'd found purpose, found a reason to wake up every morning and pin that badge to his chest. The children he'd saved, the networks he'd helped dismantle, the deputy he'd trained who now stood as strong as any lawman he'd known. These were the victories that mattered, not the gunfights or the arrests, but the lives that continued because someone had cared enough to intervene. That was a legacy he'd leave. That was the mark he'd make on this wild, brutal, beautiful frontier. The deputy had grown into a man the sheriff was proud to call partner. No longer a broken boy clutching a note. No longer a victim defined by what had been done to him. He'd become something else. A protector, a fighter for justice. Someone who understood both the darkness people were capable of and the light they could choose instead. They still rode together often, sheriff and deputy, older lawmen and younger, moving across the territory answering calls for help. They developed an unspoken language, could read each other in tense situations, could trust each other when trust meant the difference between living and dying. It was a kind of partnership that made the badge bearable, made the weight of it something that could be shared. One autumn afternoon, they received word of suspicious activity at an abandoned ranch near the county line. Children had been seen being loaded into a wagon. The pattern was familiar, horribly familiar. The sheriff felt his jaw tighten. After all these years, after all the arrests and laws and awareness, still, predators found ways. Still, children needed saving. He looked at his deputy and saw the same determination, the same anger held carefully in check. They'd stopped this evil before. They'd stop it again. That's what the badge demanded. That's what their history required. They saddled their horses as the sun began its descent, painting the frontier in shades of orange and gold. The ride to justice had become routine, but the commitment to it never faded. The rescue played out like a memory, like the sheriff was living through that first case again, but with different hands doing the work. His deputy took the lead this time, made the approach, assessed the situation, planned the action. The sheriff watched with pride and gratitude, watched this young man he'd found broken on a dust trail, now breaking down doors to save other children. The operation was swift and clean. The perpetrators were arrested. The children were freed. 6 of them this time. 6 lives pulled back from the edge. 6 futures given a chance. As they rode back toward town with the children safe behind them, the sheriff felt a profound sense of completion. The circle had closed. The boy he'd saved had become the man who saved others. Justice had become a legacy that would outlive him. That night, in the office, the sheriff pulled out the note. The original note that had started everything. He showed it to his deputy, who hadn't seen it in years. They looked at it together. 7 words that had changed the course of both their lives. 7 words that had sparked a movement. 7 words that had saved hundreds of children across multiple territories. The deputy touched the paper gently, remembering the sister who'd written it, remembering the desperation and hope that had gone into those shaky letters. The sheriff told him it was time. Time for the note to belong to someone else. Time for the deputy to carry it forward, to remember why the work mattered when cases got hard and people got cruel. The deputy accepted it with reverence, promised to keep it safe, promised to honor what it represented. The sheriff retired 6 months later. Didn't go far, just took off the badge and stayed in town. Helped with the school, advised new lawmen when they asked, watched his deputy become sheriff and trained deputies of his own. The work continued. Children were saved. Traffickers were arrested. The frontier kept changing, kept being pushed towards something better by people who refused to accept darkness as inevitable. The old sheriff would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over prairie, and think about all the lives that had intersected with his, all the children who'd made it out, all the ones who hadn't. He carried both, honored both, let both drive him to keep speaking up, keep pointing new lawmen toward what mattered. The sister visited him often in his retirement. She'd bring children from the school, let them meet the man who'd started it all, let them hear his stories, let them understand that justice was real and people could be saved and darkness didn't always win. The old sheriff would tell them about the note, about 7 words and a boy's courage, about how small acts of bravery could ripple outward and change everything. He'd tell them that they mattered, that their stories mattered, that what had been done to them was wrong, but what they chose to do with their futures was entirely their own. Some of those children would grow up and become teachers, lawmen, people who helped others. The cycle continued. The light spread. The frontier, slowly and stubbornly, became a place where children could be children again. On quiet nights, the old sheriff would think about that first ride to the homestead, about the fear and determination that had pushed him forward, about the moment he'd seen all those children in that barn, and known he'd do whatever it took to free them. He'd been younger then, faster, stronger, but not braver. Bravery wasn't about age or strength. It was about the choice to act when action was required, about the refusal to look away when looking away would be easier. The frontier had taught him that lesson over and over, had shown him that one person could make a difference, that evil thrived on silence and withered under attention, that justice wasn't some abstract concept, but a daily choice made by people who decided that children mattered more than convenience. And in the end, that's all a badge really was. A promise to care when others wouldn't, a commitment to stand when others sat, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. The old sheriff had kept that promise, had honored that commitment, had fought that fight, and because he had, the frontier was different. Not perfect, not safe, but better, and better was enough. Better was everything. What do you think happens next on the frontier? Share your thoughts in the comments below.